Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today it is World Book Day. Now, I usually map out what we're going to be talking about for the week, and I've actually made a change because initially I had a different topic for tonight's talk. However, because it's World Book Day, I decided to do a talk on one of the most precious collection of books that I actually own, and that is this collection just of here. Now I'm going to show you in a bit more detail in a moment, but these books are absolutely fantastic. They're probably the oldest books that I actually own on my bookcase, and these date from 1807, so they're actually very old, and I look after them very carefully. I keep them in a place where I know the temperature doesn't fluctuate too quickly or two extremes, for example, and they're actually laid down very carefully, so they're not actually stacked up as you would do with books normally. So these are really precious things. And the interesting thing is about World Book Day is everyone is basically saying what their favourite book is, and I have quite a few favourites. However, what I decided is to talk about those, and I will talk about them in a bit more detail in a moment. We'd also like to know on World Book Day what your favourite books are as well. I know Helen, Ian and myself, we all have our favourites, and I'm sure everyone out there has a favourite also. It could be a fiction book, it could be, like most of the books that I own, it could be a factual book, a non-fiction book really. So these were gifted to me by a very close friend who knew that I would love them, and I have loved them ever since I got them. I was given these about, I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago now, and they're really well made. But they would be, it's 1807. It's not like most books today where they're mass produced, mass glued together, mass stapled, for example, in some cases, and then churned out on a printer. There is a lot of love gone into these. So they're actual books with very hard covers. And if you look through the playlist, I was talking about books relatively recently, and it shows you, or I explained in a bit of detail of how they're actually made. And there's a long process. And as I said previously, that's why books are so precious. They would have been unbelievably expensive years ago. In 1807, they would have been still pretty expensive things. The big difference now, however, is in 1807, there was printing works that were producing books a lot quicker than having, for example, a hand-drawn and handwritten book, as they were often in the medieval period, really. So it's very nicely made. It's also been embossed as well, and you can see that on there. Hopefully you can see the tooling on it as well, where they've actually carved into the leather. There's obviously a lot of gold on there as well. They've really put a lot of effort into it. And when you lie the books down, hopefully you can see that on the edges of all the pages, when they're all together, you can see the marbling that the sheets of paper has actually gone through. So like I said, there's a lot of work that's gone into these books, and you can also see running down the spine there where they're actually put together. So they're stitched, the leaves are stitched together, and then they're bound with this fine leather work, and they are absolutely fantastic books. When you open them up on the inside, you have also got the standard, typical, really nice marbling work, which would have all been done by hand initially. And it just goes to show how important books are. So on World Book Day, instead of talking about the topic we had planned in our diary, today we're going to talk about this collection, or I am going to talk about this collection. And these books were gifted to me, and it's called The History of the Rebellion. Now you're probably thinking, what rebellion is that? Is this a book about, for example, the French Revolution or something like that? It's not. This is the history of the rebellion, or as it was sometimes called, the history of the rebellion and the English Civil War. And I will note there, it often refers to the English Civil War. So in a way, it sort of ignores the fact that it involved the whole of Britain. It ignores the fact that Scotland was involved, Ireland and Wales also. So this is the history of the rebellion, and it was produced by a man called Edward Hyde. And Edward Hyde became the first Earl of Clarendon, which is what you also have on the spine there. So you have the title on there, The History of the Rebellion, and then underneath Clarendon, and he was the first Earl of Clarendon. And it's actually 6 volumes produced in the year 1807. So that's volume 1. They're all pretty much about the same size. Volume 2 has a bit of damage to the spine, unfortunately. Could be repaired at some point, and I may have it repaired at some point because I do know a bookbinder. We have volume 3. They're all slightly different in size. We have a very small volume 4. There we go. It's probably the smallest one of the lot. And then we also have volume 5. And it ends with volume 6, obviously. And volume 6 also holds towards the back the index, which is obviously pretty important, really. Now, the actual book was put together during the English Civil Wars because Edward Hyde was someone that was very much a royalist person. He was a gentleman of society, and he sided with the royalist cause specifically. However, he was one for reform as well, but not too much reform, because there were a few things to do with the church, for example, that he didn't agree on. So we know he was a royalist. Some people do say the history of the rebellion, these books here, are actually quite siding with the royalist cause. And when you do read them, it does sound as if a royalist wrote it. And it would be, because he was, after all, a royalist. The other interesting thing about these books is they were predominantly wrote during the latter part of the Civil War. So 1646 and 1648, or between those years, 1646 and 1648. And he would have penned them in loose leaf paper. So he would have sat there with his pen, with his ink, and he wrote about the English Civil War. He actually talks about the war with the initial sparks being ignited in the 1640s early on, so 1640, 1641. But what you have to remember is the best thing about these is they were wrote at the time. Some people do say that's a bad thing. He's a royalist, so he would be siding with the royalist cause over everything. But at the end of the day, it's a fantastic piece of work. 6 whole volumes covering the whole history of the English Civil War. And it is an absolute important, in a way, Bible for anyone studying the English Civil War. The first ones were actually produced or printed early on in the 1700s. So you have the first edition coming out in 1702. There was also an edition out in 1704. But my set here, printed in Oxford, came out in 1807. So they're really, really old, but they're absolutely fantastic works of a history. They are, in fact, the first complete history of the Civil Wars ever written. Now, saying that, there were many books being produced in the Civil War, even, believe it or not, but more so after the Civil War, on, for example, local impacts of the war. For example, there is a very good book that was wrote towards the end of the Civil War on the Civil War in Ludlow, for example. But these books, Clarendon's History of the Rebellion, actually covers the whole of the Civil War. So it covers the whole of the wars in general. But the other interesting thing is it's also partly a biography of Edward Hyde as well. And that's down to the fact, really, that he wrote it. So he put in his own personal experiences of living during that time. Now, I'm not going to read the whole lot, but at the very beginning of volume 1, there's a nice little introduction, really, and it shows that he is a royalist. So it says here, "At length comes into the world the first volume of the history of the rebellion and the civil wars in England, begun in the year 1641 with the precedent, passages and actions that contributed thereunto, and the happy end and conclusion thereof, by the King blessed restoration and the return upon the 29th of May in the year 1660, written by Edward, Earl of Clarendon, once Lord High Chancellor of England and Chancellor of the famous University of Oxford." Oxford. So you have to remember, he was born into quite a wealthy family. He was educated at Oxford and went on to be part of the royalist cause, basically very close friends with Charles I himself. And as I mentioned, during the mid part of the Civil War, so after the Battle of Naseby, so around about the time of the Siege of Worcester, for example, 1646 to 48, that was his main time where he was putting down what was going on in society. And like I said, he also covered things about his daily life in there. But the history of the rebellion, or Clarendon, as it's often referred to, is an absolutely important book for anyone looking at the English Civil War. Yes, there is some bias into it because he was a royalist, but on World Book Day, I must say these 6 volumes has probably been one of the best gifts that I've ever been given. If you get a chance, do look out for it in shops. They do turn up every now and again in antique bookshops. You may be lucky enough to find one in, for example, a charity shop. I've never seen one in a charity shop, but you may find one in there. And I don't actually think they've actually been reprinted. They may have done, so let us know if they have and if you've got a copy. But personally, for anyone studying the Civil War, it's almost one of those books that you should have on the shelf. For anyone looking at the Civil War in Worcestershire, and I've said this numerous times before, it is worth getting hold of this book as well. And this one is The Civil War in Worcestershire by Willis Bund, the great historian that Worcester once had. The copy we have here was actually produced in 1905. And like I said, the best thing about this book is it's very, very much on the slant of Worcester is not quite the faithful city. As it says in the, if you look on the inside, the full title is The Civil War in Worcestershire and the Scotch Invasion of 1651. So it's really referring to them as being an invading Scottish army. But that's one if you're looking at the Civil War locally. So as we said at the very, very start, it's World Book Day, and I'm sure you have some fantastic books as well. Do let us know. Comment on here when we finish the video, and when it gets uploaded onto Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, maybe comment on there of what your favourite book is. It's World Book Day. Let's celebrate books. On that note, stay in, stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.